Thank you everyone for joining our session today, Weathering the Roadblocks, Developing Resilience Around Local Constraints. My name's Amanda Mullen. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the National Academy of Public Administration, and I lead our Extreme Weather Resilience Hub work, which was initiated in May of 2025 to explore governance and financing structures that enable local adaptation and resilience. We're so grateful to have everyone with us today to talk about this really timely discussion and hear about practical advice on how communities can advance resilience even in the face of constraints, including fragmented programs, regulatory challenges, and really emphasizing the need for stronger coordination across our jurisdictions and sectors. We know across the country, extreme weather events are becoming more frequent, severe, and disruptive, and this is really challenging our local governments, our community-based organizations, and regional partners who are at the front lines of this work. They are being asked to plan for extreme heat, for flooding, for storms, drought, wildfire risk, infrastructure strain, and public health impacts, while also balancing a lot of other competing and immediate needs for long-term investment. So they're being asked to do a lot, and they're really, we're struggling to get from planning to action to help us with our adaptation goals and challenges. So today's webinar, we hope to explore this challenge, not just from a theory, but from a practical perspective. And how can we really accelerate getting from planning to action? What are the barriers to doing so? And when we identify those barriers, what can we do to help speed up action as public administrators and public servants? So this panel, we're going to explore how local leaders prioritize projects, translate data and scientific knowledge into decisions, into building partnerships, into aligning resources, and include communities that have been historically under-resourced, overdeveloped, or underrepresented in resilience planning. And I'm really, really excited by the panelists that we have today, bringing their deep experience, knowledge, and expertise from the state, local, academic, and applied resilience work perspective. We're going to cover a lot today, so I'm going to wrap up my remarks. Before I pass it over to Miles Murphy, if everybody can please, in the chat function, share your name, affiliation, and one important adaptation or resilience challenge facing your community. This will really help us ground the discussion today and then identify the needs of folks represented here. So with that, I'm going to kick things off, turn the mic over to my colleague, Senior Manager Miles Murphy, to introduce the panelists and moderate the session. Thanks, Miles.
Thank you, Amanda. It's great to be here with everyone. As we said, I'm excited to be hosting this conversation for the Hub and to have a chance to speak with such incredible practitioners in the resilience field. As a former town planner in a coastal community, I have faced many challenges in designing and implementing resilience projects, both on behalf of the town and in support of residents. Resilience is rarely as straightforward as it seems, even when all parties agree on the ultimate goals. To dive deeper into these challenges, especially those associated with local implementation of resilience, we have the honor of hosting Marissa Aho, who is the former Chief Resilience Officer of King County, Washington, as well as the new Principal and Practice Leader for Climate Adaptation and Resilience at Fair and Pierce. We have Mike Hinson, the Chief Resilience Officer at the Maryland Department of Emergency Management. And we have Dr. Heidi Roop, the Director of the Climate Adaptation Partnership at the University of Minnesota. So thank you all so very much for agreeing to be a part of this conversation on such an evergreen challenge that is implementing local resilience, especially as we look to the news this week, heat waves, fires, and floods, and a lot of communities that are figuring out how to navigate that. Every community in this nation has an extreme weather related challenge that they could solve through adaptation and resilience, yet they're not always choosing those solutions, or they're not choosing perhaps the best solution. How do communities decide what projects to prioritize and what tactics to deploy to implement those problem solving projects? I'll just start off with that. Whoever would like to go first?
I'm happy to go. That's a great question, and I honestly don't know why. And so I'm not going to answer that question, but I am going to just start off by asking everyone to think about like the worst headline that your community could experience. I've been in multiple communities where those headlines have come true. And so trying to figure out what that headline is and then figuring out who needs to be at the table to start to solve that headline is a really great, I think, way of combating why folks aren't doing more. And just wanted to start out with that less doom and gloomy perspective, and hopefully something that folks can think about as we're talking today.
No, a great point. Heidi, what about in Montana?
I'm in Minnesota.
Oh my gosh, Minnesota, you were talking to me earlier.
No
My
worries,
apologies.
yeah, no problem at all. Sometimes I wish I were in Montana. I'm a sagebrush country kind of gal, so yeah. But I find myself in the Midwest in Minnesota. Um, I think there are many challenges around, even just how you prioritize. I often feel like, especially at the local government scale, right, the problems and things that need fixing or doing or improving are numerous. The resources to address those numerous needs are often insufficient, and are often competing, right? There's a whole host of competing priorities. And so I think that ultimately, sort of pretty simply boils down to that. I think, I really appreciate Marissa's sort of positive frame. I often think that in many ways there is resilience work happening, even maybe we're not calling it that. And I think there's a huge amount of opportunity to think about how to, as folks are prioritizing those projects, adding those, tweedling the dial a little bit to make it a resilience investment. And so that we can actually think about how we actually mainstream the principles or ideas of resilience and foster that in the communities that we live in and that we serve, where they're already prioritizing. I know, for example, in Minnesota, I often hear when we're trying to feature stories of climate resilience investments on the landscape, that a motivator for that can be simply the right grant program, right? It's the thing we knew we need to do. We didn't really call it resilience, but it was a way to get the money to do the project. I mean, it's very practical. And so sometimes priorities emerge not just from need, but also the opportunity to connect that with finance. So again, not terribly novel or new concepts here, but I do think there's also a lot of opportunity to redefine and describe resilience actions that are occurring on the landscape that maybe people don't consider or aren't naming as such, but are really happening in many of the places that we live.
Absolutely. And I think Mike can probably build on that a little bit because Maryland, working with their resilience authorities, are looking at new ways to innovate governance to help communities like that. Mike, could you add on a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, like was just stated, there's a lot already happening, I think, and so there needs to be typically more coordination, more collaboration going on to understand what's already happening, right? We need to create a baseline understanding before we can really focus on what those next steps are. And I think that is a big issue for a lot of communities. We have typically, when we're talking about resilience projects, they can be small, but a lot of them are fairly large scale in order to be impactful. And so when you're talking about those kinds of investments, those visible projects, you want to make sure that you actually understand your baseline of where you're starting and the benchmarks for where you're trying to get to. And that in and of itself can be very burdensome for certain communities to be able to meet that threshold. So with all that said, to your point, Miles, about resilience authorities, that's just one of the tools we're trying to work through here in the state of Maryland is the proliferation of resilience authorities. Currently, we have two standalone resilience authorities and a third entity that's functioning essentially as a resilience authority, and we're looking to really grow that in the coming fiscal year for us here at the state, which we just started. So we're going to focus on really trying to grow that out. And obviously, in some of our more populated areas with a lot of projects, a lot of capability, it might be by jurisdiction, but in some of our more rural areas, there it might make sense to really have a lot of multi-jurisdictional partnerships and have those folks working together. Because speaking of other challenges for why people don't necessarily always pick the best thing to do or the right thing to do, sometimes they just don't have the capacity or the capability within their jurisdictional bounds. And that's something that I think, we can take a look at and making sure that we're maximizing the return on people's investment in both time and resources at the local and regional and state levels.
No, absolutely. Capacity and resources are always going to be paramount to any type of small or large scale project. What other types of gaps are local governments experiencing when they're trying to deploy these types of projects? I mean, we know that funding is always the number one issue, but what else is out there? Marissa?
Yeah, I have a couple. One is this disconnect between sort of planning and goal setting and implementation. And, I'm a proud planner and I have done some amazing plans. But when those plans are not implementable or when they take too long to get done and you lose the momentum. I mean, the focus of, a lot of times people celebrate at the end of completing a plan, and they should, but that's the starting line, not the finish line. And so really there are so many reasons why there's that disconnect, but a lot of the work that we are and should be doing is around making that disconnect, closing that gap. And the other one that I think about a lot is just in the weeds, and it's the bureaucracy. And it's the difference between sort of having a status quo lane and the inertia that governments get into, and then a climate lane. And that can be around procurement, that can be around contracting, all the fun stuff. But the more that we try and close that gap between the status quo lane and the climate lane or the resilience lane, the better off we are. And one of the tools that King County has is a risk appetite statement. And so this tool I used a ton as director of the executive climate office there, because when we ran into one of those disconnects or one of those sort of administrative barriers, we would lift up this documentation that we said we are prioritizing and having a higher risk appetite for climate and equity work. And so we used that as a way of busting those barriers, and it was really helpful.
Great. Sorry, I apologize. We lagged just ever so slightly there on my end at the end of your statement there, Marissa. But Heidi, you looked like you were about to jump in, so don't let me cut.
Oh, no worries. No, I think it's related. But and sort of maybe builds on it slightly different. But I think one of the challenges that we see, and I think we're increasingly working towards, is actually helping build the business case. I mean, I think they're at a scale that is relevant, right? And so it is one thing to say these big national or global numbers about the adaptation and resilience opportunity. It's very different to be able to translate that into a site specific return on investment and characterize that in terms and values that matter along the project timeline when those decisions are being made, and being able to build that business case for the folks who are financing it, right? To build the political will, navigate that bureaucracy, right? Make sure that the bidders are the best contracts are actually the ones that are making that resilience investment, even if it's a higher dollar value. And so in Minnesota, one of the things that the state has done, prompted by our legislature, was actually develop a cost of climate adaptation and resilience study for the state, specific to the state. So the study actually analyzed the cost of doing no more adaptation than is currently being implemented on the landscape, whether that's through state agency programs, federal resources that were flowing, smaller local governments making decisions, our regional development organizations enabling adaptation, and then saying how much would it across key sectors of the economy actually cost, and what would be those adaptation interventions, and where are the ones that are already occurring, and where is there effectively a willingness to adopt. So this cost study didn't evaluate everything, but is a starting point in beginning to actually articulate those benefits. Because if you can say, actually investments in adaptation can save 8 to 15 times more money in Minnesota, right? That's like Minnesota investments on our landscape. That's very different than similar numbers we pull from national studies, but that goes all the way down to the project, right? We can say this in big sort of planning scale frameworks, but finding ways, and this is something we've been talking a lot about as a program at the university and with our regional partners and local governments, is how do we more cost effectively actually do the analysis in a robust way that tells you why this investment, while the upfront cost is more, is actually going to yield more return, more public safety, all of the other benefits and co-benefits we know stem from proactive investments rather than reactive approaches to many of these challenges. So I think that's one, it's a framework, but it's also a hang up, right? If you can't say why spending more now is going to make sense in the long run in a fiscally constrained environment, well, you're going to hear no. um, right? You're not going to design for the future. You're going to design to the status quo.
And it harkens back to all of my public administration classes on benefit cost analysis and how it's so easy to show that initial capital cost of something simple and so hard to measure out everything down the road that just outweighs it. And we still struggle with that. I don't want to say how many years since I was there. But when we're looking at it from that perspective, how do we help justify this business case a little bit? Because so often when you're balancing how to find funding, how to find partners, you're working across sectors and jurisdictions. So what can we do to help communities, sort of emphasize that business case that's going to help them sell it to a lot of different stakeholders while finding the right project to invest in for their communities far future?
Yeah, so I'll hop in on this to start. So I would say the first thing is I think Heidi hit the nail on the head to start with. We need to think of the people who are going to be asked to initially back these projects. And it's going to be people who are interested in bottom line numbers typically. And so we do really need to have the cost of climate studies. We need to be working with the insurance industry so that we understand what that impact is. We're already obviously seeing that impact in some areas around the country, some more than others. But it's coming for almost all of us, that insurance industry impact, and it's one of the very direct ways to show the impacts of these kinds of investments. But you need them on board to guarantee incentives or discounts, things like that, as a matching mechanism. The other thing that we need to consider, and this will tie into it, going back to your previous question about the gaps, is there's a lot of reliance on federal funds for these projects. And while that is not a bad thing, and it should be that way, there should be federal funding to support these projects, we also need to have a plan looking towards recurring revenue to support these projects into the future. Having one big project that's federally funded and you get it done, that's great, but we know this isn't a one project solution scenario, right? This is going to be a series of projects over time, and we need to invest in it like we would invest in anything else that's a public service. And I think that's something else to think about when you're talking about how do we sell this to the various levels. You have one level that's dealing with the finances and the numbers directly. And then I think there's a different level, which is socially, how do you sell this? And not to get too far off base here, off topic, but everything that we're talking about links back to like the first two levels of, the hierarchy of needs, right? We're talking about physiological needs being supported and safety needs being supported by these projects. And that's really where we need to stick the messaging. And so that people understand these aren't niche or, special interest ideas or concerns. These are a concern for every single person. And that's how we really need to couch it when we have these conversations, in my opinion.
Well, and just to jump in, so I think the most recent numbers are that for every dollar invested, there's like a $13 benefit. And so, I mean, that is the business case. And yet we're not seeing that move the needle as much as I would think that it would. The other thing that I think about, and I've done the math, but I haven't done it recently, but I became a Chief Resilience Officer in 2015. And there have been more than, again, not recent numbers, $200 billion disasters in the United States since I became a Chief Resilience Officer. And so I regularly think about all of the things that we want for our communities that maybe we could have gotten further at providing if we didn't have more than $200 billion disasters in that time frame.
Oh, absolutely. How do you, as a small community, keep up with that one disaster that happens to impact you, let alone start planning for the future with resource constraints and everything else out there? Um, Mike, you touched on something that leads us into a slightly different question that I was curious about. You know, I remember hearing growing up in my environmental science background that one of the big challenges is still translating scientific knowledge around adaptation, resilience, and that data into actionable decision making. Is that still part of the challenge at the local level? And are these collaborations with insurance and other organizations helping to better frame some of those decisions so that it's not stuck on just scientific data, so that people have a better understanding of where and what they need to invest in to reduce risk in their communities?
It's a great question. I would say my experience has been, once again, this is within the confines of Maryland, which is not everyone's experience necessarily. But my experience has been that local leaders can tell you exactly where the problems are and what they are. It's not unknown to them. And the data, the science is not unknown to them either. I think it really does come back to the previous thing that we talked about, which is how do we fund it? How do we show that it's worth it? And then additionally, I think there's a part of this which is how do we show that value to the constituency, which gets back to figuring out how we message that other group. It's not just about getting the bottom line figures across the threshold that we need to. It's also about then they still have to go, support that publicly and make sure that they can tell them why it matters to them to make this investment as constituents. And I think that's really important and something that we can help with more. And I think getting to the return on investment is a good start, but then what does that actually mean for social capital too? Like, what are the other things that are impacted? Because these projects usually don't exist in a vacuum. They usually have co-benefits, and we really can look to outside partners as well to figure out where those additional co-benefits exist. And so I think that as we think through this thing, we started off talking about, I think we've already said a couple times, talking about collaboration and the right partners, but really thinking through our partners when we're looking at these projects and seeing where can we bring in other people not only to maximize those co-benefits, but also so that they can inform us on how this is, or how there are additional talking points that we can get across to certain audiences in order to create more and more buy-in. Everybody has their own audience, everybody has their own champions across, local groups and governments and what have you. And really, that coalition building is really important to moving these projects forward successfully. And then once you have the momentum, I think we all know, once you get the momentum, things kind of start happening and people are happy to jump on board once you're already, a group that has established wins. And I think that's a part of it too, right? Is you're building that coalition so that people can feel like they're winning together. And that's really more of the battle than, being able to translate scientific data. There's so much data, so many tools now that if anything, there's probably data and tool overload, which might be a separate issue, which I'm happy to talk about if we want to get to that as well.
I'm not opposed to that in any way, shape, or form. Heidi, it looked like you were enthusiastically nodding to support Mike
Well,
there.
and I
What would you
laugh
care to
as
add?
a tool and data developer, right? As someone whose bread and butter is um, building and and for creating a more robust understanding of the climate risk. I don't disagree with you, Mike. I'm here for it. I sort of laugh because I don't disagree. I think one of this is a bit of a segue away from, and I could talk for hours about sort of decision relevant science and how we think about improving and characterizing uncertainty to enable, like, what are the enabling conditions that actually help science move into practice and then be implemented, right? It's this whole ecosystem of actors. It's the bureaucracy that Marissa mentioned, right? It's all of the things. It's a piece of this ecosystem. But I do think two things. We have quite a ways to go, I think, in demystifying what adaptation even is and what resilience can even look like. I think we default to the bigger sort of system things, often big infrastructure. But adaptation and resilience are like asphalt binders and air purification systems in homes and churches and schools, right? And places of business and work, and early warning systems. And, we have small communities in Minnesota that are very prone to severe weather. Aspects of severe weather are being made worse by climate change, right? That science remains slightly unsettled, but point still stands that some of these communities, they don't even have a siren. So like first order of business, like it'd be great if the timing worked out and we could make that culvert bigger or prevent that icing from forming and causing all sorts of damage every freeze thaw cycle we have more of now, right? But we are also there. So I think it's also sort of blowing open the conversation around what constitutes a resilience investment and how can we actually use incremental but visible, tangible, real quality of life improvement, like public safety, right, is way less controversial, and use those as door openers to saying like it's these investments and right, it is the asphalt binder, right? Do you want your highway to buckle? No. Right? Do we need gravel roads that can move our corn to market that are robust? Yes. There is resilience and adaptation opportunity in all of those spaces, and I think we miss opportunities to really have those conversations in the language that makes sense in those moments to sort of even think about how we demystify or sort of uncover where resilience decisions can be made, and maybe where they already are, or even just a refinement in our thinking, or our material might result in a resilience benefit. I think the second thing, while I'm here standing on my soapbox, is that we still have a long way to go in our monitoring, our evaluation, and our learning. So we have some examples of what works some places. We have a lot of collaboration and peer learning that we can do more of. But I also think it is hard when something doesn't fail. It's not really a story, but we still have to be prepared and positioned to tell that story, because the fact that the road didn't fail because it got elevated, right? Or the culvert didn't burst, right? Again, there are dots that are harder to connect here, but being able to tell those stories is harder, but still critical. And actually being able to say that these investments are working is going to be increasingly essential as we're on this ongoing journey of adaptation, right? As Mike said, it's not a single investment in a single point in time. Adaptation and building this, it's iterative. What resilience even means and how we achieve it is going to change through space and time. It's going to change based on geography, based on our societal culture, all of these things, right? That makes it really fascinating and complex. But I think those are sort of two pieces I think we have to keep an eye on. More opportunity for describing what adaptation is and showing it and telling it, and then really understanding that what we're doing is working, where and why, and where else might it work or might not work, and being really honest about that.
Those are two great points, Heidi and Mike. I appreciate your comments as well. Marissa, I wonder if I might turn to you, because Heidi has me thinking about what we're seeing a lot in especially bigger communities that again have the capacity, is establishing resilience plans with or climate action plans or extreme weather or hazard plans that have dashboards and checklists and things that allow us to kind of really visualize those big and small steps towards achieving community resilience or completing projects. Can you tell us about your experience in King County with that, perhaps?
Yeah, happy to. And not just King County. When especially, capacity is an issue for every community, large or small. I've worked in big cities, capacity was still an issue. But working with partners to figure out how to increase transparency and accountability for these plans. And so that's been something I've been focused on for years. And in Houston, one of the great things that we did as part of the Resilient Houston Strategy implementation was partner with Rice University in order to have sort of external partners at an academic institution help us as a city hold ourselves accountable. And so we were working with folks to make sure that our 1-year reporting was accurate, our 2-year reporting, our 3-year reporting, and we were able to sort of show where we were meeting our goals and, quite frankly, where we were not. And that is as important. King County recently completed the 2025 Strategic Climate Action Plan in October. And part of that work for a couple of years there was really trying to attach a transparent dashboard accountability measure so that folks, community members, people who were inside the county working on implementing the plan, elected officials, you name it, could see progress over the 5-year time horizon for this plan. And so happy to report that that dashboard is up. I think it's a great example of being able to show where there is momentum and where maybe there isn't, and it's time to readjust. And so the more that we, recognize that it's not one person at a city or county or community, it's not a team, it takes everybody in order to move this work forward. And if we can have tools that empower people to take on that role better, then that momentum that we've been talking about has a better likelihood of continuing.
Absolutely. The right number of tools, not too many, not too few, and they need to be accurate. Um, so, we've talked a lot about what individual jurisdictions are facing. Mike, you mentioned it at the top with the overview of resilience authorities, and I open this up to anyone, but adaptation, mitigation, resilience, extreme weather events cross boundaries with really no qualms about where we think they should stop. Some communities have tremendous amount of resources, others don't, for a lot of different reasons. Some are dealing with massive areas that they have to deal with. Some are very small but very dense and deal with different challenges. But those challenges extend beyond their borders. How do we help set up resilience plans and undertake projects that are going to enable communities to work together to achieve a better sense of shared resilience in their communities?
So, I mean, I'll tell you what we're doing along those lines to support that here in Maryland, outside of the Resilience Authority stuff that I've already mentioned. I think like the very first foundational thing that we did when our office was created was we provided the groundwork for a community of practice. We already were a pretty advanced state as far as resilience work was concerned, but the problem was it was dispersed across the entirety of state government, local governments. It was kind of all over the place. A lot was happening, a lot of action, but it wasn't necessarily unified, and things weren't being communicated quite enough to make any kind of alignment. And so I think one of the things we first did was just bring the people together, find out who all the players are who are in this space. And in Maryland, we are an all hazards office, so it's a pretty big space, and our sectors are not just related to environment and climate. We go into, to be clear, I'd say just, but there's other things such as housing, infrastructure, food systems, and local government community capacity. All these things are kind of covered in our purview and our scope. And so I guess what I'm getting to here is that we had a lot of partners to get to. It wasn't just like one lane of partners. And I think just figuring out who all the, who's who in the zoo was like step one to figure out what we were going to do next, because we needed to establish that, the initial groundwork of who was doing what programs existed, who had what funding sources. Then of course the gap analysis of like, where are we not hearing from anybody? Is that because we're missing them, or is that because it doesn't exist currently, which is a whole separate issue. And so that would be like number one, is creating the community of practice. I would think something else that really needs to happen is the coordination of funding sources from the federal level, dealing with philanthropic partners, figuring out where the best practices are around incorporating private dollars, if that makes sense, depending on the project or type of government structure. We can't expect, other folks here have said, we can't expect that every jurisdiction is going to have the capability or capacity to handle those things. And so that's one of the real value adds that I think a state can bring, or a larger, more regional body can bring, is kind of working through those hurdles. and finding a way that we can streamline it for locals. Because the last thing I'll talk about on the multi-jurisdictional thing here is that we've spent a lot of time focusing on not just here, but in general in resilience, like money, 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 funding, funding, funding. How do we fund all these projects? And what happens is when we do get money, then the goal becomes to get the money out the door. And in order to get the money out the door, you have to pick from the projects that are available to you. And that creates a relationship of haves and have-nots, where the haves are able to get projects planned and designed and across the threshold for funding, and the have-nots continue to fall further behind. And it's something that we really need to focus on, which is supporting with direct technical assistance those vulnerable communities to get them to the same position so that we're not just picking the best projects available to us when there is funding, but we're picking the best projects, period. Um, and I'll stop there. I could talk a long time on that one, but I'll stop there.
Oh, Heidi, Marissa, anything to add before otherwise I'll move on.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly, and this is maybe controversial, and I would really love Marissa and Mike's take on this. As I think about sort of the planning to implementation timeline that we've already been talking about, sort of really grappling with the strategic opportunities to not only think about standalone resilience plans and strategies, but this idea of thinking about in sort of different scales of governance, different scales of impacts, right? Like I'm in right now in Minnesota, we're choking on wildfire smoke alongside many of our folks to the east, with a heat wave, right? These sort of compounding events, they're incredibly challenging, and yet there are, I think, opportunities to think about how we're really integrating these principles and concepts in climate plans, but also other places where plans occur, and they occur already in a multi sort of jurisdictional, regional scale, right? Comprehensive economic development strategies, or SEDS, for example. Those are focused on resilience, economic resilience, but those are shocks and stressors on the economy. Climate is most definitely one of those. And so I think also really thinking about how and where we leverage existing planning frameworks, that, again, sort of situate things in dollars and cents, that help us unpack where that planning is already occurring on a regular cycle, and sort of moving away from standalone climate planning and really thinking about integrating resilience in all the types of transportation planning, right? It's in all the places. And I know there are a lot of folks, including present company, who've thought a lot about how do you mainstream, right? We do need these plans, but how do we really put it in the places, in many cases, where it really matters, and it becomes more durable, because it becomes integrative. It's part of that connective tissue in a region to a jurisdiction between a state, right? There are these quasi-governmental bodies that are really important in the fabric of moving across scales of governance, navigating bureaucracy, moving and flowing funding of different types and flavors to projects, right? And so I think it's I definitely agree with Mike, that pre-positioning funding and planning for resilience, so that you're looking at a full roster of priorities when the funding comes. But from that planning framework, I think thinking a little bit more about how to really leverage things like our SEDS and planning that happens at those different scales, as essential to actually building and working towards transformative adaptation, rather than these incremental pieces and projects, which are important and where we find ourselves. But right, that accelerant, I think, sits somewhere in that space, that there's really opportunity when those different actors are already coming together, to make plans.
Yes. Um, I 100% agree. And where standalone resilience or climate planning helps build that momentum that you need to move work forward, and you have the capacity to do those standalone plans, I think they're great. And use what you got. So a lot of communities don't have the resources to do that. And there are a number of plans that are required. And so you see this trend of some states requiring more of this work to be integrated into comprehensive or general plans. And I love seeing that. And there is an opportunity to have a both and situation, where if you can do a separate plan on a particular hazard, wildfire, heat, you name it, that's great, because that helps focus that momentum. But those things should also be integrated into every required plan, so that everyone is working on the solution, and it's not perpetuating silos that we already have. One of my favorite things that I got to do when King County released its extreme heat plan was to talk to a number of elected officials from the cities within King County and say, do not do your own extreme heat plan. The team had done outreach to, 900 plus people in the region, and it really was this comprehensive plan for the county and all of the communities within it. And so instead I said, pick the three things that resonate with you in the plan and figure out how to implement them in your communities. And that's a real great opportunity to borrow from other people's plans. And, plus one, like, yep, this is a great plan. We're going to use it to implement a couple of things that we know we can do well for our communities, rather than spend that energy, those resources, that time on thinking that you need to do another plan.
If I
Don't
could,
rebuild the wheel, right? Go ahead, Mike.
I was just gonna say, I just want to hop in on this because there's some great stuff being talked about here, which I think is really important. First thing, little self-congratulatory for the state of Maryland, but we did just get the resilience as one of the 8 pillars of our comprehensive plan, so that is working its way through the state right now, and we were heavily involved in that with the Maryland Department of Planning. So. They were fantastic partners on that, and I think you'll find that there's a lot of appetite for that at the state and local levels. People want to be on board. Um, and then the other thing I want to talk to is, yeah, using what you already have is, Marissa, fantastic point. We don't need to keep dumping resources. Dumping resources is not working our way through a solution. It's just dumping resources. And so we need to think about what do we already have, and how can we maximize that. And sometimes you do need to spend more resources on planning or what have you, but a lot of times there's enough there to get started, and then really see where you're at. And so for that kind of that side of things, I'll say we've started a new pilot where we're working with the University of Maryland, having a group of capstone students actually go through a region's available plans. So all the plans that, like I mentioned earlier, anything in their housing, their hazard mitigation plans, anything like that, they're going through all their plans, all the action item tables, everything that's covered, and aggregating all of that data into one place, and then, going through it and figuring out how it can be best be separated thematically or what have you. And all that's leading to a series of pilot workshops we're doing with the regions throughout the state. The idea being that we're not just going to come in and create more work for you. We're trying to come in with a lot of the homework done, and we're asking you to take it to that next step. We don't want to spend time just having a workshop and creating more plans and more homework for people. We want you to come in and feel like you accomplished something because we're able to get a lot of the work done with the work you've already done. And I've once again mentioning what I said earlier, whereas once you get that momentum and people on board, people feel like they did something, then when you haven't asked for them in the future, they already have that idea behind your effort that you're people who move things forward. You're people who come to the table with an objective, and not just for the purpose of having a meeting or writing a plan that sits on a shelf, which we're all afraid of, right? So, anyway, I'll stop there and just say that. Oh, actually, one last thing, which while I'm thinking about it, is uh, we look to our locals not for full resilience plans because of what Marissa already said. There's a lot going on there. We're looking specifically for project pipelines. We want to create those project pipelines from the local level so that we at the state can figure out how we can help with direct technical assistance, like I mentioned, for those communities that are maybe in the ideation phase but aren't in a plan, aren't into design, and definitely aren't shovel ready. How do we get them the resources they need? And then the people who are shovel ready, how do we best maximize our return on investment, and how do we use our funds to make sure we're, really doing everything we can, and those investments are happening in the areas where we can move the needle the most. Um, anyway, and there I will actually stop.
Oh, a lot of great facts spread throughout there, Mike. I won't respond to them all. We are in the last 15 minutes of our programming here, so if you have a question or comment, please feel free to drop it, and we will see if our panelists are able to answer it. The one that we do have is interesting. I might rephrase it a little bit. there are a lot of investments that need to be made in a lot of different communities struggling with challenges. And some are better decisions than others in the short term versus the long run, but they all need to be made in order to help the whole community be more successful and resilient. How do you sort of address triage of dealing with adaptation and resilience of projects of, let's say, repeat loss communities that we see so often on our coastal areas and our flood prone areas, especially? The retreat is always a topic brought up, but when looked at on a large scale, very hard to actually implement and very difficult to for any community member to get behind. How do you balance those types of investments where you know investment is needed, but you also know that it may not yield the same results as investment in other areas of the community?
Clearly, that's a great question. Um, I mean, the first thing that popped into my mind was that more times, more times than not, my approach has been very opportunistic rather than what I will say is strategic. And I think that we need more strategic approaches, but over the last many years, often uh the stars align on something and you've got the ability to move it forward, and it may or may not be the most strategic, but it is in fact the thing that you're going to move forward because the stars have aligned and you can be opportunistic and um sort of move forward what you can. And in this space, you're pushing a lot of very heavy boulders up very heavy hills, and it's really reactionary sometimes to, oh, that boulder's moving, like we got to move that boulder. And you're juggling them all at the same time. And so I think it's a really good question. And where there are external funds, where there are external partners, where there's that, again, we've used it a lot, but momentum, I would go with that over sort of what might look better on paper.
Yeah, I'll just hop in and say I think a lot of it also has to do so much with the community itself, and that probably plays into what Marissa is saying too, which is like that momentum. But if you have buy-in at the time, like then sometimes that might be your only course of action that's available to you. So I would just say that so much of it is at the community level and their willingness, the range of willingness is, because to your point there are good investments in areas that are geographically vulnerable. There are good investments that can be made, but not every investment is a good investment in those areas. And so I think it's a real balance where we have to use the best available. I'm going to go circle back on what I said previously, or go back on what I said previously. We need to look at all the data and tools to see to see, where those vulnerabilities are and like the real risk that we're looking at, and make the decisions kind of on a one by one basis, along with that underlying, factor of how bought in is the community to what the outcomes of that are. Because ultimately, you can try to do whatever you want, but if a community that you're trying to impact, if they aren't on board, who wins? Who really wins in that scenario, right? And I think that that is something that is going to be a growing issue we're going to be facing. And to the underlying point of your question about, you know, what I think is the underlying point, which is like, when do we put good dollars after bad? And I would say that that is going to be more and more of the question over the course of the next 5, 10, 20 plus years. Is we're going to have some of those serious conversations. Like I was saying earlier, I think that insurance industry involvement is going to play a big role in that. Because ultimately it's not just the government says this or that decision, it's going to be the market that's bearing it out as well. And I think that's going to have a huge, huge impact on people's willingness.
this may come across as slightly naive, but I think in in relationship to that reality, I also think we can't lose the fact that there's got to be humanity and not bureaucracy at the heart of this work because it is necessarily relational and durable, right? Because where problems are the most pressing or what even the impacts are, right, of a road that, yes, maybe cars can't drive across it, but there are undoubtedly other really meaningful, real impacts in that community that aren't being captured by our map or our satellite images or an AI bot, right? And so I think we have to really call upon ourselves. You know, we've talked about collaboration, coordination. I think it's finding ways to really foster and sustain those relationships because at the heart of these decisions, how you prioritize, right? The market will help prioritize, right? But is that really the first order priority? I think we have to make sure we're really not losing the humanity that these conversations really require in those relationships, right? And that requires more than individual governments. That requires bringing more people into the conversation, but also being willing to sustain that conversation. Because I think at the heart of a lot of this is going to be increasingly trust, right? And trust across actors, across scales of government, and in places where it has historically maybe not been fostered. And so I think that's a really important part of what we do and who gets to define what adaptation is or what resilience is. A lot of these decisions will determine who or what or where is able to withstand or recover from a myriad events and stressors, right, that are being amplified. You know, this sort of threat amplifier that is, say, climate change, which is something I think a lot about. But when we think about asking people to leave their homes or landscapes that they've been in for time immemorial, those are not one and done conversations. Those are long-term dialogue and collaborative and necessitate a lot of listening. And so I think we also have to think about our funding structures and our capacity that enable us to really meet this moment and that reality.
It doesn't sound naive at all to me. Empathy, understanding, accountability, transparency, those are all things that are critical to government at all levels. As the Academy always says, trust in government is paramount. And, that's even more emphasized at the local level. We've had a bunch of submissions in the chat and in the Q&A, so I'm gonna just throw out one more question here as talking about the local level. So much of this, especially in small communities, is what type of impacts are these adaptation and resilience projects going to have on not just the community writ large from a government perspective, but local businesses, citizens. How do communities ensure, both in their own jurisdiction and across jurisdictions, that they're effectively surveying the community to understand what, the residents think is actually most paramount to be addressed? I mean, you can't take public opinion for everything, but make sure that community members have an impact and on what decisions are being made about what is addressed in their own backyard.
Sure. So I'll hop in on that, talk about what we've done. So, uh, First of all, I think a lot of our planning efforts in the state already require that local interaction from comp plans to hazard mitigation plans, transportation plans, all those things have waypoints with public involvement. That being said, that doesn't mean that that's the end all be all. To Heidi's point, just a second ago, I really love what she said about making sure those conversations are that the right people are being included. And I would add to that, like that along the correct timeline. And by that, I mean as early in the timeline as possible. And that is something that I think is of the utmost importance. So I can say for us in our office, what we specifically are trying to do, we just went from creating something for the state, internal to the state, to get all of our ducks in a row and create that alignment I spoke to earlier. And now, as we go into the regional stage of things that I mentioned previously, we are specifically inviting those key community partners. So we're reaching out when we're having those regional workshops where we're working on project pipelines and things like that. They will be in the room. When we're in the middle of ideating and going over what's on lists, what's not on lists, why is it not on a list, all those things, we want to have them in the conversation early. one, to create buy-in, but also because they bring very valuable information to the table. You can only get so much. Having formerly been in local government for over a decade before I came to the state, even as a local, where I had a pretty well-defined area to know, I found out new things all the time. And so we can't even rely on just the local governments to know necessarily everything that's happening all the time. Those things that the community members bring to the table are very important. And it's not just to get buy-in, like I said, it's also because they are bringing true value to the end product. And so I think just getting them involved early and often, making sure you have deliberate and intentional ways that their input is being taken, not just like inviting them to a random meeting and presenting at them, but actually having opportunities for interaction and input with real deliverables, I think is of a pretty high importance for me.
Great. Well, I will say that having just run a series of working groups for the District of Columbia, that having stakeholders in the room for conversations and small groups and everything that is not just a presentation is so much more meaningful in so many ways to coming to more collaborative decisions, even on the hardest topics. So we're at the end of our time here, everyone. So I apologize to those questions and comments that we did not have a chance to address, but I just want to take a second to thank Marissa, Heidi, and Mike for joining us. You all were fantastic, and I appreciate you pivoting with a few questions that were not already rehearsed ahead of time there. So, but we'll go ahead and wrap things up for the day. So thank you so much to those of you that attended the webinar this afternoon. We're so very grateful for the time that you spent with us. The Academy and its Extreme Weather Resilience Hub will continue to be focusing on these challenges with great partners like those you see on your screen, as well as with other critical organizations and all levels of government. So please stay tuned for other opportunities. This webinar will be recorded and available, or is being recorded and will be available on YouTube later this week or early next. So feel free to share it with those that you think could benefit from hearing about it. And never hesitate to reach out to any of us with any questions or concerns. This is a group effort. If we're going to ever achieve more aggressive and impactful, meaningful adaptation and resilience across the nation. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.